Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP Psychology on YouTube. This is Miss Fenton, and I teach at Adlai E. Stevenson in Lincolnshire, Illinois. So today, we're going to go over some material that we covered yesterday. So we're going to kind of refresh motivation, and then we're going to talk about emotion. And motivation and emotion, there's a set of theories that go with each one, and it's really helpful sometimes to maybe make a graphic organizer, organize your thoughts so that you can separate the two. We're also going to talk about stress, the physical and psychological components of stress, and motivational conflict theory as well. So yesterday at the end, I mentioned that if you had questions, you could send us an email to this Gmail address, and we will try to answer you. And I said that I couldn't say your name or your school on the video unless you explicitly said that. So if you want me to include your name and your school, or for Dr. Swope to do that, you have to explicitly state that in your email along with your question. And we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible the rest of this week and all of next week, especially next week during, AP Prep Week review. So first of all, thank you to Keenan from Mountain View High School. He asked a question of me. He said, what's my favorite unit? And it's really hard, but, I'm going to have to go with development because, babies. We also got another question from Brianna, and she attends Penn Manor High School, and this is her pet rat named Toe, which is short for Play-Doh. I think it's so cute. So in her AP Psych class, they're really lucky. They get to classically and operatively condition rats, actually live in their classroom. So their teacher is pretty amazing. And I believe the teacher might be one Miss Vita. So if that's your teacher, Brianna, say hello to her for me. But to answer your question about the sleep cycle, so this is something you could write out and you could have in front of you if you were anxious about it on the exam. But the sleep cycle, what you have to remember is that there's only one stage one, right? So as you're falling asleep at stage one, then stage two, then deeper to deep sleep, stage three, then back up to stage two, and then REM. So it repeats 2, 3, 2, REM, 2, 3, 2, REM. So the REMs are kind of always between the twos, right? And you only have stage one once. So hopefully that helps, but really try to think about also how the sleep stages impacts behavior. Like maybe talk about, think about studying or reviewing circadian rhythms as well. So thank you to Keenan and Brianna. And also, if you send me a picture of your pet, you also have to say it's okay that I can share it. Otherwise, I will not. So got a really great picture of a turtle eating bok choy, but the student didn't say I could share the picture, so I can't. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go over that FRQ from yesterday. So yesterday was a 6-point, completely research methods practice question. So on the AP exam, you're going to have 25 minutes to do that concept application, 5 minutes to upload, and then you're going to have 15 minutes to answer a question very much like this potentially. And you're going to have maybe an abstract, like a section from a study, and this one I made pretty short because I'm trying to fit it on one PowerPoint slide. And maybe you might get a graph or a chart, or in this case, it's a scatter plot. And then a series of questions that are asking you to apply skills 2 and 3, those skills about interpreting data and analyzing research. So the first question that was asked was, what's the most appropriate conclusion that can be drawn from the figure, right? So this is a scatter plot. So what you want to do is make sure that you make a correlational claim. And you should be able to tell from the direction of the scatter that this is a positive correlation. So by the slope of the schedules of the scatter. So based on the scatter plot, the researchers could conclude that greater amounts of sleep is associated with higher levels of reported happiness. And there's other ways you could word it. You could say, based on the scatter plot, referring to the question, researchers could conclude that fewer hours of sleep is associated with lower levels or lower levels of reported happiness. Or if you really wanted to use psychological terminology, you would say that this is a positive correlation or a direct relationship. So between self-reported sleep and self-reported happiness levels. So what's important here is that you're using correlational language. So you want to say things like, happiness scores predicts self-reported sleep, or they're related, or they're associated, or there's a tendency, or maybe a link. What you want to not do is ever say anything about cause and effect. So if you were to explain a conclusion that involved getting enough sleep caused you to be happy. Now that's incorrect, because that's a cause and effect conclusion, and you need a experiment with random assignment to come up with that. And remember, when you do a correlational study, they often pull data from things like questionnaires, surveys, interviews. They might get it out of a case study, and that's how you get those two variables. Okay, next question says, give an operational definition of the variable on the x-axis. So first thing you have to know is which one's the x-axis. And so the x-axis is horizontal. So it's going from left to right. So, and if this were an experiment and you were graphing, you would put the independent variable on the x-axis. In this case, though, the variable on the horizontal or x-axis is self-reported sleep. And if you're going to operationally define that, it would say the number of hours of sleep each week. And you always, if possible, want to operationally define things. So next up, we have what's an operational definition of the variable on the y-axis. So in this is the vertical axis. So for this one, it's going to be levels of happiness. And operationally, you might say their score on a happiness level ranging from 1 to 10, or in this case, maybe 0 to 70. Now, a way to remember the x, and again, if it's a y-axis and it's an experiment, that's where you'd put the dependent variable. So in an experiment, the x-axis is the IV and the y is the DV. And if you need a mnemonic to remember x and y-axis, you can say x to the left and y to the sky. So try to remember which one is the horizontal and which one's vertical. So next up, provide an example of a descriptive statistic that could be generated by the results in this graph. So the graph itself is actually a descriptive statistic. So graphs are descriptive statistics. So what you might say here is researchers would use, based on the scatter plot, is to make a correlation coefficient. And that's the numerical value that's going to indicate the strength and direction of a relationship between the two variables. And in this situation, the correlation coefficient would be positive and pretty strong. Other examples of descriptive statistics that you could use would be like measures of central tendency. So you could say like the mean score on the happiness test, or the mean, like the average amount of sleep overall. And also more charts and graphs are also measures of variance, like the range would be descriptive statistics. What would be wrong would be something inferential, like a t-test or an ANOVA, something that created like a p-value that gave you, significance. You want descriptive stats. Those are measurements that illustrate the data, but don't make inferences about generalizing it to the population. So those would be inferential. Okay, explain a factor that might prevent the researchers from generalizing the results of the study to the larger population. So generalizability is a term you really have to understand. And this is the extent to which the relationships between variables in a sample, like your study that you do, can actually be applied to the larger population. So the researchers cannot generalize the results because random sampling is missing, right? They used only participants, say, for one college. There's also, you could say in another way, you could say there's sampling bias, right? Because of a lack of random sampling. All the participants were college students from the same school. And so it's really hard to then apply those findings to all college students, or even harder, to like all individuals. Or you could say the researchers will have trouble generalizing the results of this study to the larger population because the sample is too small, right? So there are 28 dots on that scatter plot. That's a pretty small sample. But you probably, if you're talking about generalizability, you want to talk about random sampling. So a lack of random assignment alone would not score. You need random assignment in an experiment for cause and effect conclusions, but for generalizability, you're going to also need that random sampling. If it's just talking about sample size being too small, that's probably not enough without adding that idea that creates sampling bias. Okay, another quick reminder about these terms that kind of sound alike. Random sampling is the process of choosing individuals from the population to be in the study by chance. So this is creating the group that you're going to do research with. Random assignment is an experiment, and that's placing your participants by chance, that's what random means, into either an experimental condition or a control. And that's to eliminate or alleviate, reduce confounding variables. Okay, finally, we have an ethical concern that leads, what ethical concern might have led researchers to choose this method. So they used a correlational design, potentially because it would be unethical if your independent variable was sleep, to deprive people of sleep. It's a potential ethical problem. So we have another student question here. And we actually got this question from a few people. What should you do if you're running out of time? Should you skip right to the application? So this is Zoe and her dog Minnie. So hi, Zoe. Thank you for your question. And again, this is really something that's going to be handled best by practicing, right? So you know that you're going to have a 6-point research FRQ. So in 15 minutes, which is tight for time, right? So the best thing you can do is keep practicing, keep doing these practices that we're providing and timing yourself. Obviously, the application is what scores. So you always want to answer that first, potentially. I mean, I shouldn't say first. Like if you follow SOTAs and you define and then apply, right? What you're going to do is make sure that everything in that definition would be in your application. So if you are running short on time, you could certainly just apply first and define second, or when you're applying, maybe think about your definition and make sure it's all there, right? So there's a variety of ways you can do this. And I think what you have to do is practice, right? And experiment, because you have plenty of time before the exam. And the more you practice, the more confident you'll feel and the more relaxed you'll be. So SOTAs check. Did you double check to make sure you use synonyms? So we also got several questions about synonyms. So I just threw out an example here with the term like observational learning. If you were asked on the prompt to give an example of observational learning while someone was learning to play basketball, right? If you said, Meg, for example, maybe the prompt was about someone named Meg. Meg learns to shoot layups by watching her older sister and then copying her technique, right? So what you have here is all of the pieces of that definition. So she's learning, right? Which means she's creating a relatively permanent change in behavior. So her behavior is she has new technique, right? And she's learning by observing, so she's watching. Where synonyms would be a problem is if you wrote simply, Meg learns to shoot layups by observing her sister, right? So that's basically repeating the term observational learning. So if you take a look at this short little response, right, and you try to read this sentence without using the words learning or observational anytime they show up, you would end up with Meg to shoot layups by her sister, right? You have no complete thought. You can say, Meg learns to shoot layups, right, by watching her sister and then copying it. It's not that you can't say learn or observe. It's just you can't only say that. Like you have to actually explain the term. So hopefully that helps a little bit about what we mean by synonyms. And the reason why that sort of thing happens sometimes is just time pressure, right? Like you know the word and you just write something. So if you have time at the end, double check and make sure that you didn't do that. It's easy to fix. You just add in a synonym for observe, like watch, and then copy for learn. Okay, and again, we always want to emphasize that it's the applications that score. Okay, yesterday, I gave you a tip. I asked you to consider the process of motivation through the lens of the psychological approaches. And if you had these different terms, which of the modern approaches to psychology or perspectives would you do this? Would use these terms? Which would be associated best with what approach or perspective? So again, motivation is the whys of behavior, the mental processes, the factors that direct and sustain goal-oriented actions. So which approaches would explain motivation? Motivation is the result of, well, it depends on which perspective you ask. And there are certainly more than one answer for some of these, but potentially you had psychodynamic going with unconscious processes. Behaviorism, if you remember Pavlov and Watson and Skinner, that was learned associations. And extrinsic motivation or incentives would be reinforcements for someone like Skinner. For cognitive, you might have added cognitive dissonance, intrinsic motivation, over-justification effect, affiliation motivation. For social cognitive, that's Bandura. So I would naturally want to put Bandura with social cognitive with self-efficacy theory. With biological, if you notice here, I have affiliation again, because there is a a lot of research to support that affiliation drive is biologically based. You certainly would see affiliation in something like the evolutionary perspective. Fulfilling rank-ordered needs is humanistic, and sociocultural motivations is it's impacted by norms, like learned norms from your family or your faith or your community, right? And achievement is often a learned goal that's influenced by culture. So with cognitive dissonance, if we're going back to the cognitive piece, remember cognitive dissonance is the discomfort that occurs when your beliefs and your behaviors don't match, right? Which that tension, that discomfort, that anxiety that is caused by that motivates you to change your behavior. And I do want to point out with evolutionary that you want to be talking about natural selection. So certain behaviors are in the human species today because early humans who did those were successful. They were naturally selected, these motivations, because they provided a survival or reproductive advantage. With evolution, you want to be careful. You don't want to say, survival of the fittest. That's not going to be enough. That phrase isn't even something that Darwin used, right? It was somebody later using, but survival of the fittest alone is not an example. Anything related to evolutionary, you probably want to be talking about natural selection. I also asked you to try this as a review. How would you sort motivation theories in the biopsychosocial approach? And so I made one way of organizing this, certainly not the only way. And you can have a discussion about this, maybe think about these terms deeply. Should things be in two places, in more than one place? Is it maybe you'd sort it differently and explain why? That's the type deep thinking that you need to be doing to prepare for your exam. And just one more little shout out for Albert Bandura. Remember, he appears in so many units. So you want to be really clear that you understand all of Bandura's ideas. And the same would be true for, James and a Skinner and a Maslow. It's not so much about the name, but any name that's called out this much during the year, those concepts you should study and you should have those down. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about emotion. And emotion is a three-part definition. So there's physiological arousal in the body. So this is autonomic nervous system. And I put up a little chart here where you have the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. And you have the cognitive part of an emotion, right? Which is the conscious experience, the thoughts, the memories, the values, the expectations you associate with each emotion. And cognitive part of emotion also includes this term that psychologists use called affect, which is the feeling associated with an emotion that kind of goes on two dimensions, right? So emotions can be both pleasant to unpleasant, so somewhere on that continuum, and then strength of the arousal, like weak to strong, like you could be really, really happy or just kind of mildly amused. And then finally, you have the behavioral piece that goes along with emotion, which is your facial expressions, gestures, body positions, and ultimately actions. So starting again with Darwin and the evolutionary theory of emotion, Darwin's going to argue, and evolutionary theory would state that emotions are innate reactions and corresponding facial expressions that were naturally selected because they gave early humans a adaptive advantage, right? A survival or reproductive advantage. And so they're going to focus on, what is the adaptive value of specific emotions? So something like joy, like pleasure that you experience maybe when you eat something sweet, or that's like high in fat or high in sugar. So that's rewarding to us, and we repeat it. Disgust, maybe to avoid eating poisonous or rotting foods. And fear helped, us to avoid predators. So when you're looking at these emotion theories, we're going to talk about a few that are very, process orientated. So James-Lange, Cannon-Bard, Schachter-Singer. This is what they're kind of looking at. They're discussing what comes first, right? Bodily arousal, like your heart racing, or the experience of the emotion. In which order does this happen? And historic theories of emotion and modern ones are still looking at these two questions. So how does thinking play into emotion? Does it have to come first always? So this is William James, and that is my favorite picture of William James. Again, he is, psychologist, on the best dress list. Got a high style marks there. So James and Carl Lange created an emotion theory. And if you remember James, the same William James from functionalism that we talked about in Unit 1, his theory is that you're going to have an emotion-provoking stimulus, then your body is going to react to it. That's that autonomic nervous system arousal. You're going to have a physiological reaction. Maybe your heart races. And your brain is going to automatically, unconsciously experience an emotion in your mind, right? And what makes this interesting is it kind of flips common sense on its head, right? Common sense would be the other way around. It would say your heart is racing and now you feel happy, right? He's saying it's the other way around, right? I'm sorry. You would say you're happy and then your heart races. That would be common sense. It's hard to say one thing and read another. So with James-Lange, he's flipping it. He's going to say that the physical reaction comes first and then the automatic experience of an emotion. So with James-Lange, we see something, right? That's your emotion-provoking stimulus. Our body reacts. Maybe our heart starts beating. And that physical reaction causes the emotion of, say, fear, anger, joy. So not only do we need the body, but basically all we need is the body. So this theory does not discuss cognition. So if you look at the strengths and weaknesses of the James-Lange theory, strengths would be stimuli do create physiological responses that lead to emotion, right? There is cross-cultural research that shows that we consistently describe emotions and corresponding bodily reactions across cultures. But we do have some problems, right? Namely, the biggest one probably is that it doesn't consider cognition at all. And we can sometimes have physiological arousal, like without even having an emotion. And also the body can be sometimes too slow, right? Emotions can be sometimes instantaneous. And also, there's some evidence from like PET scans that show that somatosensory processes do happen sometimes before the report of an emotion. Now, the facial feedback theory is a newer theory, and this says that activity in the facial muscles that create, facial expressions cue the brain to determine the correct emotion to experience. So if your face is in a smiling position, the information that your muscles of your face are making a smiling expression is being taken to your brain, and your brain believes you, right? And says, I guess I'm happy, right? So we smile, we experience more pleasure or happiness. We frown, we experience more sadness. And there's been some interesting research with injections of Botox, right, to kind of paralyze some of the frowning muscles, and it resulting in depressed individuals having like small improvement in their symptoms. Next, we have Cannon-Bard, right? So Cannon-Bard is saying that there's an emotion-provoking stimulus. And sometimes in a textbook, it's like, for some reason, it's always a bear. I don't know why I'm going the wrong way here. So with James-Lange, the emotion-provoking stimulus might be a bear. Your heart starts racing, and your brain automatically decides you're afraid. With Cannon-Bard, you have the emotion-provoking stimulus. So let's say it's a bear again. And what's going to happen, according to this theory, is simultaneously, your thalamus is going to send messages to the body, creating a physiological reaction, and to the mind, and you're going to have the experience of an emotion. And that this happens at the same time. Whereas with James-Lange, you have kind of a 1, 2, 3. Stimulus, bodily reaction, then an automatic expression of an emotion. Here, you have the physical bodily reaction and the experience of an emotion simultaneously. So the strength here explains rapid experience of emotion and physiological arousal that the James-Lange theory does not. We do now know from later research that the thalamus isn't the only place for emotion. That actually involves many brain areas. And again, we're not discussing cognitive factors. So fun fact here, Walter Cannon of the Cannon-Bard theory actually coined the term fight or flight and the term homeostasis. But an even more fun fact is Walter Cannon married William James's daughter, which if you think about it, he created an emotion theory that's a critique of his father-in-law. So Thanksgiving, awkward. Next up, we have Joseph Ledoux and the dual pathway theory. So now we have cognition, right? So what he's saying is that an emotion, like a strong emotion like fear, when you get that stimulus, when that comes in, so in this case, it's through the vision, right, so through her eye, right, it's going to travel along two different tracks, two different pathways at the same time. It's just unlike cannon barred. This one's acknowledging that one is slow and one is fast. So the slow road, okay, is the high road. So what's going to happen is the thinking high road is you have a fear stimulus. Maybe she saw a snake. That's going to go from her optic nerve. It's going to go to her thalamus. It's going to go to the sensory cortex, right? It's going to go to maybe the visual center of our occipital lobe. Then it's going to travel to the frontal lobe, and then it's going to get to the amygdala. So that's going to take longer. It's like a longer route. But the low road, it's like, I guess you can say lower in the brain or older in the brain. Fear stimulus, thalamus, amygdala react, right? So they use different terms, but like cannon barred, you have simultaneous messages. It's just this one is talking about one's going to get there faster than the other. So this theory would work for things like fears and also maybe simple likes or dislikes. It's a dual pathway of emotion. Next up, we have Schachter and Singer, or the two-factor theory. It could be written either way. I like to kind of combine them and just call it Schachter two-factor, which of course leaves out Singer, so sorry, Singer. But you have a two-factor theory, so you should have two factors. You should have two components, right? So you have an emotion-provoking stimulus. Here's your bear again. Factor number one, physiological reaction. Factor number two, this is a cognitive label, right? Your brain is actually going to interpret the situation that you're in and label that emotion, and that's the emotion that you experience. So factor one, physiological reaction. Factor two, your interpretation, right? You're like, that's a bear, I'm afraid, as opposed to that's a bear, I'm in love. Maybe you would feel that way. So the brain scans the environment in factor two and appraises what's happening and gives a cognitive label to that physiological arousal. So the thoughts that you have in this case are actually influencing the emotion that you feel. And it's that bodily reaction, it's factor one, that's going to give you feedback and influence the intensity of that emotion. Next up, we have Richard Lazarus and the cognitive appraisal theory. So now we have another cognitive theory. And this says that the effortful or sometimes unconscious thought process can happen before you experience the emotion. And he talks about primary appraisal. You decide if the event is going to affect you personally. And then second, how are you going to deal with it? Okay, so just kind of looking at these. It's a little bit hard to follow. Take a look at this image, right? So if you're talking about Ledoux and the dual pathway or cannon barred or even James-Lange, there's no emphasis really on cognition initially, right? Well, a little bit with Ledoux after the fact, but it's immediately before the conscious appraisal. With Schachter-Singer and Lazarus, you have a much greater influence on the cognitive component. Okay, also kind of related to evolutionary theory is like what kind of emotions are universal? And sociocultural approach would look at this too. Like, does everybody in the world experience the same emotions? And when we're angry or we're happy, do we make the same facial expression? And most researchers agree that anger, fear, disgust, sadness, and happiness are pretty basic emotions that are universal, cross-cultural, right? Carol Izard, she identified 10, and she argues that any other emotion is actually like a combination. So she might say that joy is actually interest and excitement. So these are maybe naturally occurring because babies have these same expressions. And I love these images. I feel like they should make t-shirts. You know, I want surprise baby the shirt. I think that's hilarious. So Paul Ekman is a researcher who developed a neurocultural theory of universal facial expressions. He's devoted an enormous amount of time to studying facial movements and facial expressions and their connection to emotions cross-culturally. And regardless of cultural background, individuals can typically identify these the same. So if you look at these images, you should be able to determine which one is which emotion. You should be able to pick out and differentiate, say, sad from fear. No culture, however, did Ekman find where people frown when they're really happy. Ekman also talked about this idea of display rules. So this is culture's impact, whereas happiness is the same and sadness is the same emotion and it has the same facial expression. Display rules are culturally determined, kind of learned rules or norms through socialization about when and to what degree you demonstrate spontaneous emotion, right, or publicly. And cultures differ in how much emotion is expressed kind of publicly. And one difference you can see is if you look at this particular study, European and American leaders are 6 times more likely to smile in their photos. And when they do smile, they smile more enthusiastically. So display rules for Americans, and we certainly can't make all Americans the same, but in general, they're more likely than maybe other cultures to smile, sometimes even smile for no reason, right? And that's not necessarily the same across cultures and across the world. Okay, quick check for understanding. Here's a couple examples. The first one, Hava is given a new kitten and she experiences the physiological changes in her heart rate as she simultaneously realizes she is happy. Number 2, 2 tourists both reach the top of the Empire State Building in New York City at the same time after running up the stairs. Their hearts are racing from the exercise. They look at each other and they label their physical response by determining they are in love. So can you, from the reverse end, look at these and identify the emotion theory? So with Hava and the kitten, this is Cannon Bard. So she's experiencing these simultaneously. If it were the Ledoux dual pathway theory, you would have to describe in more detail the slow and the fast pathway. So what you would be asked to do on the AP exam would be to create the example. In this case, I'm giving you the example and having you identify the concept. And with the 2 tourists, so this has a cognitive label that's happening after the physiological arousal, and this is Schachter-Singer or Schachter 2-factor. So for practice on your own, I would say take the emotion of happiness or the emotion of fear or the emotion of anger or disgust, whatever one you want, and create an original example for each of the following theories, right? And put it in a scenario like, disgust from each of these theories on vacation, happiness at a soccer game from each of these theories. That would be a great way to practice, and practice writing FRQ applications for difficult terms is how you're going to prepare for that concept application question. All right, let's talk about stress. So stress is the physical and psychological response to factors that challenge our homeostasis. They challenge our functioning. And there's a physiological stress response that we talk about in terms of fight or flight, right? It's mobilizing your body for attacking or escaping a threat. And it can be acute, right? It's a short-term stressor with a defined ending, like a big exam, or you have to give one speech one time, or it's the bear. Assuming that you fight or flee, then you won't see the bear again. But you're not going to necessarily have a fight or run away from a big exam, but you're going to have this physiological sympathetic nervous system response. It's not literally fighting or fleeing. And you could have a chronic stressor. So sometimes things just don't go away, right? You have an ongoing long-term threat, right? Maybe it's a really high stress job or an uncomfortable work environment or a long-term illness. Those are chronic stressors. And with the fight or flight response, you have the hypothalamus signaling the pituitary gland to signal the adrenal glands to produce those stress hormones. There's 2 different ways to look at the stress response. We have the SAM system, right? The sympathetic adrenal medullary, and then you have the hypothalamic pituitary, right? So you have 2 versions. The first one, SAM, is nervous and endocrine's fast response. And this is more for an acute stressor, something that just shows up. And then your body also has a slower response to chronic stressors. And you can kind of compare these. I'm going to go a little fast here so we can keep on schedule, but I would strongly recommend that you review these and kind of compare them so you can take a look at them side by side. So with chronic stressors, they help you cope with an extended exposure to a stressor, and it can aid you and help getting you back to homeostasis, but high levels for a long time can cause problems. So with stress and illness, does stress cause illness? So the immune system, when it's functioning, right, it maintains your health by isolating and destroying, bacteria, viruses, or other invaders, right? And there's 4 types of cells that kind of search and destroy, which I have, you can see here in this image. And they are going to be what actually goes out and attacks this. So this is another infographic. Stress may not directly cause illness, but it can make you more vulnerable by influencing your behaviors and your physiology. A really important stress theory is one created by this man, Hans Selye, and it talks about the body's regular 3-stage pattern of reactions to ongoing or chronic stressors, right? So you have this alarm reaction that's kind of designed for an acute stressor, but you also have a different bodily response to chronic stressors. And Selye did research with rats, and he found that, when he stressed them, maybe kind of forced exercise, or they would start out by heading into this alarm phase, right? And the alarm phase is when you're going to have the highest level of stress hormones. You're going to have epinephrine and norepinephrine causing your heart to rate and respiration to increase. And these symptoms are uncomfortable, but the body can return to homeostasis quickly when the stressor is eliminated, right? No harm, no foul. What Selye was studying is what happens if the stressor doesn't leave. And what happens next is this resistance phase where you have higher levels of stress hormones, less than an alarm, but still very high. And if this were happening to you, you might be kind of feeling a sense of anxiety or pressure or being driven. And then unfortunately with exhaustion, right, this is when the body gets to the point where it can tolerate no further stress, right? This could lead to illness. And in the animals, in the rats, they suffered, organ damage and sometimes even death in the exhaustion phase. Another way to look at stress is that you can compare it in terms of like distress and eustress, right? So unpleasant or positive stressors. If you're talking about frustration, you're talking about stress that results from being blocked from a goal. Conflict is a forced choice that's difficult. And we're going to talk about like 4 different types of conflict in a minute. Life changes are any significant alteration to your like kind of long-term day-to-day life. So it could be, starting college, right? That's a big life change. Getting married. Pressure is demands that are placed on you by other people or yourself to kind of get a particular job done. Anxiety can be described a little bit more like a vague apprehension or feeling, right, of distress. Daily hassles can kind of add up, but this is just like the small things that happen on most days. So during the school day, students might complain about, people walking slow in the hall, right? Or it could be catching a train and it makes you late. Or there's a train every day you have to wait for. You have a long commute. And other stressors that are distress might be things like really serious things like inequality and discrimination, or potentially like adjusting to like a new culture or a new place. And then we have eustress, right? So things that can still be stressful, like, starting college, even going on a vacation, holidays, because there's a lot going on. There's maybe a lot of pressure, but it's still a positive thing. Okay, with Lazarus, we talked about him earlier with emotion, and you can talk about him in terms of a cognitive response to stress. So primary appraisal is our initial impression, right? Is this event, is this stressor important? Is it threatening? Is this stimuli positive or negative? And then the secondary appraisal is about determining how you're going to respond, right? You're going to access your resources and try to come up with a way to handle the problem, handle the stressor, which we call coping. In problem-focused coping, you're doing strategies that directly deal with that stressor head-on to either decrease it or eliminate it. With emotion-focused coping, you are using strategies or methods to relieve or regulate your reactions to a stressor. So maybe you can't eliminate it, like there's no way for you to get rid of that particular stressor, but you can focus on your own emotions, right? Maybe you could use emotion-focused coping to, practice relaxation techniques or mindfulness. So for Lazarus, his appraisal theory for stress is that how we interpret, there's that cognitive piece, how we interpret the stressors and our stress response actually impacts our outcome. So if you view stress or a stressor like an AP exam or a tough math test as a challenge, right? instead of a threat, like the way you cognitively think about it, you can have a healthier both physiological response and psychological response to stressors, right? And stress for Lazarus is that it's more about how we interpret events than the events themselves. Conflict theory. So first of all, if you have one of these terms, if they show up on your FRQ, read carefully. Again, they look visually the same. You know, if you have 25 minutes to write your essay and you read avoidance-avoidance and somehow you misread that as approach-avoidance, or you'll have the wrong answer. So just zero in on these terms, make sure you're reading it correctly. If it's a conflict, your application has to indicate that the person is experiencing stress because they're being forced to make a difficult choice, where like two desires or impulses are competing for expression, for example. If it's approach, then you have to make a choice, right? But both choices are good, right? So someone says you can have a free cookie or a free brownie, right? And you like both cookies and brownies, but you can only pick one. You know, that's an approach conflict, and it might cause you to vacillate, kind of go back and forth, like what to do, right? If it's avoid, now you're being asked to pick one of two options. You have to choose one, and you don't like either, right? Your parents say you have to either clean the garage or mow the lawn, and you don't like either, but you have to pick one. Now, if it's approach avoid, you are both attracted to and repelled by the same goal, right? So somebody offers you a donut, right? And your conflict is, should you eat the donut or not? Well, the donut's delicious. That's the approach piece, right? But it also is empty calories, and maybe you'll be hungry again in 5 minutes anyway. So what to do? Eat the donut, not eat the donut. Good and bad, approach, avoid. And then double approach, or sometimes multiple approach, avoid conflicts are the more sophisticated, difficult decisions we have to make in life. So now you have two choices, and both of them have good and bad options. So you get accepted to two different universities, right? And you can only go to one, right? So maybe you applied to two and you got into both. Now what do, right? One of them is in a really warm climate, right? So that's good, but it's really expensive. So you're going to have to take more loans. The other one's less expensive, but it's in a really cold climate and you don't like that. So what to do, right? You have two options and they both have good and bad pieces. So again, if you have an FRQ related to a conflict type, specifically indicate something is liked, right? Approach. So you like cookies and you like brownies, right? So that's approach. If you like cookies and you don't like some other food, you don't like bananas, right? Then that's not a conflict, right? That's not a difficult choice. If someone says, do you want to have $1 million or have to pay a fine, you're going to choose the obvious choice, right? So it has to be a forced choice that's difficult, otherwise it's not a conflict. So make sure that you are clarifying what's liked and what's disliked, and that the person has a difficult choice to make. So again, create your own. So take something like any scenario that you've seen in a previous FRQ, and for those individuals in the scenario, come up with a different one. So here I gave you a prompt, right? Someone's starting a new job or they're offered a new job. Can you make that an example from each of these 4 types of conflict related to that scenario? That's prep for the FRQ concept application. Okay, debrief and summary. So today we went over that previous FRQ. It was a 6 points. That's exactly how many points you're going to have on your AP exam research question. We covered the components of emotion theories. We reviewed motivation theory, and we talked about stress. And remember, you might want to take some time and practice kind of organizing this. Just make your own graphic organizer for this. Okay, for tomorrow, you're going to have this little short FRQ. It's concept application. So on the actual AP exam, you would have 8 terms. So here, this is about 4. So this is 4 concepts or 4 tasks. So give yourself about half the time. So Jordan has this date at the amusement park. How can you explain Jordan and how his emotions or his motivations through these different theories? So you have James-Lange, drive reduction, the dual pathway theory, and I gave you an approach avoidance conflict. Okay, looking forward to next week. It is AP exam prep week, and we have 3 guests coming next week. We're going to have Elizabeth Loftus, an eminent just researcher of huge importance in memory. Claude Steele about stereotype threats and stereotypes. And a new addition, we are looking to hopefully have Angela Duckworth, PhD, and her research is in something called grit, which is a personality characteristic that you can grow and improve in yourself. And grit involves perseverance and the motivation to pursue long-term goals. And high levels of grit is correlated with high levels of achievement. So hopefully we can have some great other speakers to give you some inspiration and answer your questions. Make sure you keep those questions coming. You can send us an email and we will try to answer as many as we can. And we're going to try to answer some live in these presentations, but we cannot do a shout out to you unless you give us your permission. And just say, we gave you permission to use my first name and my school and to do a shout out with my question. And if you have a picture of a pet, same thing, you have to give us permission so we can feature your animals. So thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again tomorrow and all of next week. Happy studying and best of luck.